She had worn the same gray dress to 3 consecutive Tuesdays. Not because she was poor, though she had been once in the specific way that well-bred girls become poor when their fathers drink the last of the family silver. Not because she lacked taste. Eleanor Ashworth had exquisite taste, which made the gray dress a quiet act of protest nobody witnessed. She wore it because Lord Cavendish had not looked at her since January, and January had been 7 months ago, and a woman stops choosing colors when there is no one left to notice them. She was 22 years old and she felt ancient. Harcourt Manor sat 16 miles from anything worth mentioning, on a stretch of English countryside so relentlessly peaceful it had started to feel like a punishment. The tenants called her my lady with genuine warmth. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fenn, a stout woman with magnificent eyebrows, had developed a habit of leaving small violets outside Eleanor's study door without explanation. The dogs adored her. 3 years of this. 3 years of being adored by everyone except the one man whose name she now carried. And Eleanor had learned something useful about herself. She did not need saving. She had believed at 19, trembling in a church that smelled of old candles and her stepmother's relief, that the arrangement was simple. Lord Cavendish received an agreeable wife, Eleanor received security, and somewhere in the middle they would find a way to be kind to one another. She had prepared herself for indifference. She had not prepared herself for invisibility. For the way he had installed her here like a piece of furniture he intended to collect later, and then apparently forgotten entirely. His letters came quarterly. They read like parliamentary minutes. The North Gate requires repair. Ensure Pickering manages the autumn accounts. No greeting. No name. She had started signing her replies the same way. No warmth. No softness. Just Harcourt Manor's affairs are in order, my lord. And sometimes when she was feeling something she couldn't quite name, she'd add a deliberate period where a warmer woman might have placed a comma. It was Mrs. Fenn who first mentioned Bath. Lady Crosswick is hosting the season's first assembly, she said, setting Eleanor's morning tea down with the careful precision of a woman delivering intelligence. She's asked particular after you, my lady. Not as a courtesy. As a request. Eleanor had looked up from the land ledger she'd been correcting. Pickering's arithmetic was enthusiastic but imprecise, and said nothing for a long moment. Lady Crosswick, she repeated. 3 letters. Each one warmer than the last. Eleanor set down her pen. Outside, the November fields stretched flat and gray and endless. A crow landed on the garden wall and looked at her with the frank indifference of a creature that answered to no one. She thought of the gray dress. She thought of the violets left quietly at her door by a woman who understood without being told that small things matter when large things have failed. She thought of 3 years. Tell Pickering to arrange the carriage, she said. We leave Thursday. She did not write to inform Lord Cavendish. This was not an act of rebellion. It was something more dangerous. It simply did not occur to her that she needed to. He had not written to ask if she was well. He had not written to ask if she was lonely or bored, or slowly becoming someone he would not recognize if she walked past him in a crowded room. She owed him the running of his household, and she had run it with a precision that would have embarrassed his secretary. She did not owe him an accounting of her person. Bath in November had a particular quality to it, not the shimmering spectacle of the summer season, but something quieter and more honest, the city breathing after the crowds had left, the assembly rooms less gilded and more real. Lady Crosswick, who was 63 and had buried 2 husbands and outlasted 3 scandals with cheerful efficiency, met Eleanor at the door of her townhouse on Pulteney Street and looked at her for a long, assessing moment. You're thinner, she said. And considerably prettier than I expected. You expected plain? Eleanor asked. I expected defeated. Lady Crosswick took her arm. I'm relieved to be wrong. The assembly was on Friday. Eleanor borrowed a gown from Lady Crosswick's younger sister, pale gold, with a neckline that was perfectly respectable and somehow felt like a declaration. She did not know what she was declaring. Only that the gray dress had been left behind in a wardrobe at Harcourt Manor, and she had not looked back at it. She would remember later that she was laughing when he first saw her. Not the polite laughter of ballrooms. The real kind, the kind that catches you off guard and escapes before you can make it presentable. Lady Crosswick had said something wicked about the Lord Lieutenant's wig, and Eleanor had laughed like she hadn't laughed in 3 years, her head tilting back, her hand pressed briefly to her mouth as though trying to recapture it. She did not recapture it. And across the room, cutting through the crowd with the unhurried certainty of a man accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves around him, the Duke of Weston stopped walking. He looked at her the way people look at something they weren't expecting to find beautiful. Eleanor did not notice him yet. He was still laughing. The Duke of Weston had excellent reasons to be in Bath that were none of anyone's business. His name was Aldrich Pemberton, and he had inherited the dukedom at 31 when his older brother rode a horse into a stone wall on a dare. A detail that society had romanticized into tragedy, and Aldrich had never bothered to correct because the truth was too absurd, and grief, he'd learned, does not require an audience to be real. He was 34 now, dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it weren't quite so accustomed to being unimpressed. He was not cruel. He was simply, as his closest friend Lord Bertie Halshaw frequently complained, unreachable. "You stand in rooms like you're waiting for them to end," Bertie had told him once, not unkindly. Aldrich had not disagreed. He was standing in precisely that manner when he heard the laugh. It was not musical the way ballroom laughter was supposed to be, measured and light and designed to carry just far enough to be noticed. This came from somewhere real, like it had been pulled out against its will. He turned before he'd decided to, which was unusual. Aldrich was a man who decided everything before he did it. The woman in gold had her hand over her mouth, shoulders shaking, eyes bright with something that had nothing to do with performance. The older woman beside her, Lady Crosswick, he placed her after a moment, was looking rather pleased with herself. Around them the usual assembly machinery ground on, couples rotating, fans oscillating, violins threading through it all like a needle through cloth. But this woman, she was not performing. That was the thing he couldn't look away from. Every other person in this room was performing. Performing elegance, performing disinterest, performing the precise degree of delight that their station required. This woman was simply there in the old-fashioned sense, present inside her own body in a room full of people who had vacated theirs. He crossed to Lady Crosswick before he'd planned to do that either. "Your Grace." Lady Crosswick received him with the composure of someone who had expected this, which needled him slightly. "How gratifying that you've wandered in our direction. Lady Crosswick." He inclined his head, and then, because there was no graceful way around it, "I don't believe I know your companion." The woman in gold had composed herself by now. She was looking at him with dark brown eyes that were direct in a way that stopped just short of impertinent, assessing him with a frankness most women reserved for the privacy of their own thoughts. He found he didn't mind it. "Eleanor," Lady Crosswick said with the careful neutrality of someone not saying something, "this is Aldrich Pemberton, the Duke of Weston." "Your Grace, Eleanor." Just Eleanor. No family name offered. No title. He noted it and let it pass. "My lady," he said. "Your Grace." Her voice was steady. Not nervous, not performing warmth. Just steady, the way ground is steady when you've learned to distrust surfaces that give way beneath you. "Are you acquainted with Lady Crosswick through the usual mechanisms or the unusual ones?" He blinked. Beside them, Lady Crosswick made a sound suspiciously close to delight. "I'm not certain I know the difference," he said. "The usual is cards and connection. The unusual is that she once told my stepmother a truth my stepmother did not enjoy hearing, and I have been grateful to her ever since." A small pause. "I wondered if you might have a similar story." "Nothing so interesting," he admitted. "Cards and connection, I'm afraid." "Pity." But she smiled when she said it, brief and genuine, and gone before he could be sure of it. He asked her to dance. She agreed with a composure that suggested she was either very calm or very practiced at appearing so, and he suspected as he led her onto the floor that it was something else entirely, that she had simply stopped caring what the room thought of her, and the absence of that particular anxiety had left something steadier in its place. The opening notes of the waltz arranged them. Her hand in his was light, correct, the prescribed distance between them maintained with precision. But she held herself like a woman who had learned her own spine was reliable, shoulders easy, chin level, none of the self-conscious angles of girls who weren't sure yet where their edges were. "You're not from Bath," he said. "No. London. Occasionally." A pause, the kind with something moving underneath it. "Mostly Harcourt." He knew Harcourt, a manor in the folds of the Surrey countryside. Cavendishland, if he recalled correctly. He did not pursue it. Something in the way she'd said occasionally, like London was a city that belonged to someone else, that she visited the way one visits a country with a complicated history, made him hold the thread loosely. "Do you like Bath?" he asked instead. She considered it with an honesty that was slightly startling. "I like that no one here knows what I'm supposed to be," she said. "It makes the air easier." He looked at her. She looked back, untroubled by the directness of it, and he had the distinct and inconvenient sensation of a door opening somewhere in his chest that he had not unlocked. "Yes," he said, quieter than he'd intended. "I know that feeling precisely." The music moved them through its measures. Her hand in his stayed light. The room turned around them the way rooms do, warm and loud and full of its own concerns, and within it they occupied a small quiet of their own making, not intimate, not exactly, but specific. Particular. The kind of space that forms when two people are, for once, actually talking. He made her laugh again before the dance ended. This time she didn't try to recapture it. He sought her out twice more before supper. The second time to argue gently about whether Tennyson's later work had lost something the earlier work carried. She thought yes, he thought the question was more complicated, and they went around it pleasantly for 20 minutes without resolving anything. The third time was no pretext at all. He simply found himself beside her near the tall windows that looked out onto the lamplit street, and she had glanced up and said, again, without inflection, and he had said, apparently, and neither of them had moved away. She was telling him about a crow. A crow that lived on the garden wall of her estate and watched her with what she had decided was philosophical resignation. She said it without self-pity as a fact about her life, the same way someone might mention the weather. And this, he would think about later, was the moment. Not the laugh. Not the dance. The crow. The matter-of-fact way she described a life that sounded profoundly solitary and offered it to him not as complaint but as information. As though she trusted him already with the undecorated version. He was asking her something, he couldn't afterwards recall what, only that he was leaning slightly toward her, the noise of the room having somehow receded without his permission, when the doors at the far end of the assembly room opened. Cold air moved through the heat of the crowd. Eleanor's gaze shifted past his shoulder, following the new arrival the way all eyes in a room shift toward a disturbance. He watched her face rather than turning to look himself. Watched the way her expression didn't collapse. It didn't do anything dramatic, but went very still like water in a glass when someone puts their hand flat on the table. The laughter went out of her eyes. Not gradually. Between one breath and the next. Aldrich turned. A man stood at the entrance, gray-streaked at the temples, patrician, impeccably dressed in the manner of men who never have to think about whether they are impeccable. Late 40s, carrying the easy authority of someone accustomed to rooms rearranging themselves. He was scanning the assembly with the expression of a man who had come to find something and expected to find it quickly. His gaze swept the room, landed on Eleanor, and stopped. Something crossed his face that Aldrich could not immediately name, not recognition or not only recognition. Something that looked uncomfortably like a man discovering he has forgotten to lock something precious and returned to find it still there but changed. Altered in some way he had not authorized. Aldrich looked back at Eleanor. Her spine had gone perfectly straight. Her chin was level. Her hands at her sides were completely still. She was wearing the face of a woman who had not been surprised, because she had stopped expecting anything, and in that absence, the absence of expectation, of hope, of whatever it was that had vacated her eyes the moment he walked in, Aldrich understood with a clarity that settled cold and quiet through him, exactly who the man at the door was. He thought. Not anger, not yet. Just recognition. So that's it. Chapter 3. The supper room was too warm. Eleanor noticed this the way she noticed most things now. with the detached precision of a woman who had learned to observe her surroundings rather than inhabit them. The candles were excessive. Someone had oversalted the consommé. The chairs scraped against the floor when people rose, and the sound crawled up her spine each time like a small, specific warning. She sat beside Lady Crosswick and ate with perfect composure and felt absolutely nothing. That was the lie she told herself for approximately 4 minutes. Then Lord Cavendish crossed the supper room toward her table, and she felt in fact quite a lot, none of it simple, none of it flattering to either of them, all of it crammed down beneath her sternum where she had learned to store things that had nowhere else to go. He looked, she searched for the word and found it, reluctantly, shaken. Not in any visible way. He was too practiced for visible. His posture was immaculate, his expression arranged into the particular brand of composed authority that had probably been bred into the Cavendish line for 6 generations. But she knew, in the way you know the weather through walls, the way you know a fire is dying before you see it dim, she knew he was shaken. The faint tension at the corner of his jaw. The precision of his steps, each one slightly too deliberate, the walk of a man reminding himself how to walk. She had spent 3 years learning to read a house. She had simply never expected to use the skill on its owner. Eleanor. He said her name like he was testing whether he still knew how to say it. She looked up at him. She did not stand. Lady Crosswick, beside her, had gone very still in the manner of a woman paying close attention while appearing to be absorbed in her sorbet. "My lord," Eleanor said. Not husband. Not James, which was his given name and which she had used exactly twice in 3 years. Once at the wedding, once when she'd written to tell him the north roof needed immediate attention before winter, and she'd included it almost accidentally, and then stared at it for a long moment before deciding not to cross it out. She had not used it since. It had started to feel like borrowing something she hadn't been offered. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat, which she had not anticipated. She'd expected him to stand, to produce some brief formal courtesy and retreat. The sitting was different. The sitting meant he intended to remain. "I was not aware you were in Bath," he said. "No," she agreed. Pause. A long one. The kind that 3 years ago she would have rushed to fill with apology or explanation, or the anxious helpfulness of a girl who understood that her primary value was in not causing inconvenience. She let it sit. The consommé cooled in front of her. Lady Crosswick extended an invitation, she said finally, when it became clear he was waiting for something. "The household is in order. Pickering has the autumn accounts. I left Mrs. Fenn in full authority over everything that requires authority." Something moved across his face. "I didn't ask about the household. You generally do." The words came out without sharpness, which was almost worse. Sharp would have been a feeling. This was just true, delivered the same way she might report on drainage repairs. "The south field is waterlogged. You generally do." He received it the same way, with the expression of a man who has just been informed of structural damage he should have noticed much sooner. "You were dancing," he said, which was not what she expected. "There is usually dancing at assemblies." "With Weston?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "I had no reason to decline." Across the room, she was aware without looking that the Duke of Weston was at a table near the windows, in conversation with Lord Bertie Halshaw, and that he had not looked in her direction once since Cavendish had walked over. This was either perfect discretion or careful performance, and she found she couldn't determine which, and found further that she minded the uncertainty more than she should have. "How long have you been in Bath?" Cavendish asked. 3 days. "And before that, Harcourt?" "Where else would I be?" Another pause. He picked up a fork and set it down again without using it. James Cavendish, she had observed at their wedding and approximately 6 times since, was a man who used stillness as armor, who communicated through the management of his own silences. She had once found this formidable. Now she found it familiar in the way that childhood homes become familiar. Not comfortable, just known, the precise location of every loose board. "You look well," he said. The words came out slightly rougher than his usual register. Like they'd caught on something on the way out. Eleanor looked at him. She thought of the grey dress. She thought of 3 Tuesdays in a row and not one letter in which he had used her name. She thought of Mrs. Fenn's violets, left without explanation outside a door. The small dignities people offer each other when the large ones have been withheld. "I am well," she said. "I have been well. I have been managing your estate and your tenants and your north roof for 3 years, and I have been well throughout." Not an accusation. Just a fact. But his jaw tightened. Lady Crosswick announced a headache at 9 o'clock with the transparency of a woman manufacturing an exit, and pressed Eleanor's hand briefly as she rose. One firm squeeze, nothing said, and drifted away into the warm machinery of the evening, leaving Eleanor sitting across from her husband with the remains of an uneaten supper between them. "Walk with me," Cavendish said. She almost declined. The refusal was there, fully formed, and she held it for a moment, weighed it. Then she folded her napkin and stood, because she was not, despite everything, a woman who ran from discomfort. She had built 3 years in Discomfort's house. She could walk with him for 10 minutes. The corridor outside the supper room was quieter. Voices from behind closed doors, the distant violin from the main hall, someone's laughter that echoed and died. Their footsteps were uneven at first, slightly out of rhythm, the walk of two people who had never learned each other's pace. "I didn't realize," he said. She waited. "When I came in." He stopped walking. She stopped too, half a step after him, and stood looking at the middle distance while he seemed to locate whatever it was he was trying to say. "I saw a woman across the room. I didn't." A pause. "The longest one yet. I didn't know it was you." Eleanor turned to look at him. His face, in the corridor light, had lost the armor entirely. This was what was underneath. Not unkind, not cold, just a man who had built such efficient walls around his own neglect that he had genuinely not seen it as neglect, and was now standing in the wreckage of that particular blindness and finding the view considerably worse than he'd expected. He had seen a woman laughing in gold, and something in him had ignited. She could see it in him, still banked now, but there. And then the woman had turned, and he had seen her face, and the ignition had become something far more complicated and far less comfortable. She understood all of this without him saying it. She wished sincerely that understanding him required more effort. "I know," she said. "Eleanor." "I know, James." His name came out quietly, worn soft at the edges. Not a gift. Not an invitation. Just his name, used because they were standing close enough in a corridor that formality had become its own kind of distance, and she was tired of distance in all its forms. "I know you didn't." He looked at her like she'd done something he didn't deserve, which was accurate. "The assembly ends at 11, she said. She made her voice practical, because practical was the shape that fit her best in this particular hallway, in this particular moment. "Lady Crosswick's carriage is arranged. You needn't." "I'll call tomorrow morning," he said. Came out with a surety that surprised them both slightly. "If you'll permit it." She studied him for a moment. The silver at his temples, the careful way he was holding himself, the specific texture of a man who was, slowly and somewhat painfully, waking up. She thought of the crow on the garden wall. Philosophical resignation. 11 o'clock, she said. "I take tea at 11. She did not smile. Neither did he. But something shifted between them, small and nameless, the way the quality of light shifts before dawn. Nothing changed yet, not really, but the darkness marginally less absolute. She walked back to the assembly alone. Aldrich Weston watched her return from across the room. He watched the door she came through, then the door her husband did not come through for another 4 minutes. And he was not a man who reached conclusions before they were warranted, but he was also not a man who refused to see what was directly in front of him. Bertie appeared at his elbow with 2 glasses of something amber. "You have the look," he said, "of a man who has found something interesting." "I have the look," Aldrich said, accepting the glass, "of a man who wishes he hadn't." Bertie followed his gaze across the room to where Eleanor had resumed her place near the windows, composed, upright, the gold dress catching the candlelight in a way that seemed privately ironic. "Ah," said Bertie. "Yes." "Is she?" "Yes." "Pause." "Rotten luck," Bertie said. Aldrich drank and said nothing, because Bertie was right and wrong simultaneously, And the specific way in which he was wrong was not something Aldrich was prepared to examine yet in a supper room on a Friday in November with the violins still playing and Eleanor Cavendish standing 30 feet away, looking out a window at the lamplit street with the expression of a woman deciding something. He did not approach her again that evening. He did, however, as she was leaving, catch her eye across the length of the room. She looked at him steadily for a moment. Something passed between them. Not a promise, not a question exactly. More like an acknowledgement. I see you. I know what this is. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Then she turned and walked out with Lady Crosswick into the November night, and Aldrich stood with his empty glass and the particular sensation of a door that has not closed all the way. In the morning, a card arrived at Lady Crosswick's house on Pulteney Street. Lord Cavendish. 11 o'clock. And beneath it, in handwriting that Eleanor stared at for longer than she would admit, her name. Just her name written by a man relearning how to use it. Chapter 4. The card sat on Eleanor's dressing table all morning. She did not look at it directly. She looked at it the way you look at a bruise. Peripherally, carefully, aware that pressing it will confirm something you're not ready to confirm. She dressed with Mrs. Fenn's niece, who Lady Crosswick had lent her for the season. A small quiet girl named Dot who had the gift of helping without hovering. Eleanor chose the green dress. Not the gold. The gold had done enough work for one season. The green was simpler, darker, the color of things that survive winter. She went down at 10:30 and sat with Lady Crosswick over tea that neither of them pretended to be interested in. You don't have to see him, Lady Crosswick said, which was the most useful thing anyone had said to Eleanor in 3 years. Precisely because it wasn't true and they both knew it and she said it anyway. I know, Eleanor said. But you will. I will. Lady Crosswick refilled her cup with the brisk efficiency of a woman who has learned that most of life's difficulties are best approached with a full cup in hand. He's not a bad man, you know. James Cavendish. She paused. He's a distracted one. There's a difference, though I'll grant you it doesn't feel like one from the inside. Eleanor looked at her. How long have you known him? Since he was 19 and convinced the world was a problem he could solve if he thought about it hard enough. A dry pause. He's been thinking very hard ever since. And the world. Still unsolved. Lady Crosswick set down her cup. But he's not without feeling, Eleanor. Last night I watched him watch you. When he first came in before he knew. She stopped. I don't think I've seen his face do that before. Eleanor said nothing. She turned her teacup in its saucer, a small precise rotation once, twice. He left me at Harcourt, she said. Not with heat. Just with the even tone of a woman stating the dimensions of a room she has memorized. Yes. For 3 years. Yes. And I built something there. She set the cup down. I built it out of his library and his tenants and Mrs. Fenn's terrible biscuits, and I built it without him, because there was no other material available. I'm not certain what he expects to find when he arrives this morning. I'm not the girl he left. No, Lady Crosswick said with something that was almost satisfaction. You are considerably more inconvenient than that. He arrived at 11:07. Eleanor noted this, the 7 minutes, and could not determine whether it was nerves or habit. James Cavendish had always struck her as a man for whom punctuality was a form of respect, which made the 7 minutes either meaningful or simply November traffic, and the fact that she couldn't tell reminded her, with a small cold clarity, how little she actually knew him. They had been married for 3 years and she could not tell his nerves from his habits. He came into Lady Crosswick's morning room and stopped just inside the door, the way people stop when they are assessing a room that might have rearranged itself since they last looked. He wore dark gray. No, she thought. He was always in dark gray. She had simply never been in a position to observe it against anything other than the formality of the very few occasions she had seen him. Here, in Lady Crosswick's cheerful clutter of silk cushions and potted ferns and afternoon light coming through white curtains, he looked slightly less assembled, slightly more visible. My lord, she said and gestured to the chair across from her. Eleanor. He sat. He carried his hat and gloves still, which was the kind of detail that didn't mean anything and somehow meant everything. a man who had not yet decided to stay. Lady Crosswick appeared, performed the precise minimum of hospitality required by decency, poured tea for both of them with unreadable serenity, and excused herself with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had engineered better exits than this. They were alone. Eleanor waited. This had become, she realized, her primary mode with him, waiting. Waiting for letters that came quarterly and said nothing. Waiting for a carriage that never arrived. Waiting for the acknowledgement, basic and human, that she existed somewhere in his considerations beyond the practical. She had waited so long and so quietly that she had somehow mistaken the waiting for peace, the absence of expectation for contentment. She was done waiting. "You said last night that you didn't know it was me," she said. "When you came in." He looked up from his tea. "Yes. And when you saw me before you knew," she held his gaze steady, asking him without flinching to be honest with her for what might be the first time. "What did you think?" The silence lasted long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "Then, I thought," he stopped. Set down his cup with a slight excess of care. "I thought I had never seen a woman look so entirely herself in a room full of people performing." Eleanor felt something move through her chest. She pressed it down. "And then you saw my face," she said. "And then I saw your face." His voice was lower now. "And I felt—" He seemed to be having some difficulty with the architecture of the sentence. James Cavendish, who spoke in Parliament with the fluency of a man who had never been at a loss for the correct word. "I felt that I had missed something. Significantly. That I had been absent from something that had gone on without me and become more than I had understood it to be." "I went on without you," Eleanor said simply. "That is what you're describing." His jaw tightened again. "I know. You left me at Harcourt. I know. You wrote to me about Gates and ledgers. I know, Eleanor." Something cracked slightly in his voice. Not dramatically. James Cavendish did nothing dramatically, but cracked nonetheless, the small sound of a wall taking pressure. "I know what I did. I knew at the time that it was insufficient. I told myself the estate required attention. That you were settled. Comfortable. A pause with something grinding underneath it. That you were fine." "I was fine," she said. "I became fine the way plants become fine growing toward a window. It does not mean the room is warm." He looked at her for a long moment. "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose it does." He came back the following morning. This had not been arranged. Eleanor came down to breakfast and found his card on the hall table and felt the same complicated arrangement of feelings she couldn't yet name or organize. Lady Crosswick read the card over her shoulder and said nothing, which was its own form of comment. He came at 10 this time. Not 11. 10, which she noted and which he probably knew she noted and which was perhaps the point. They walked. This had apparently been decided without being discussed. He arrived with the implicit expectation of it, and Eleanor, who had not left Lady Crosswick's house since the assembly, found that she wanted the outside air more than she wanted to resist the presumption. They walked along the river, the November morning thin and pale around them, the trees along the bank stripped back to their architecture, every branch visible. He asked about Harcourt. Genuinely asked, not the parliamentary inquiry of his letters, not ensure Pickering manages the accounts, but actual questions. What had she done with the East Garden? Had she continued with the library? What did she make of old Mr. Tenby in the North Cottage, who had, as far as Cavendish knew, been aggressively dying for approximately a decade without managing to complete the project? She answered. Carefully at first, waiting for the question beneath the question, the redirection toward practicality. It didn't come. He listened with the concentrated attention of a man making up for a significant deficit, and she found herself talking more than she'd intended, about the books she'd worked through, the Flemish painters she'd developed an unreasonable attachment to, the way the moors looked in February when the frost stayed on the grass until noon, a beauty so severe it was almost hostile. "I didn't know you painted," he said. "I don't. I look at paintings." Pause. "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Looking is asking questions. Painting is answering them." She considered. "I'm still mostly asking." He was quiet for a moment, the river moving alongside them, dark and easy. What do you ask? Whether things seen can be known. She hadn't said this aloud before exactly. Whether paying close enough attention to something, a field, a face, a room, tells you anything true about it. Or whether you're only ever seeing your own reflection. She felt him look at her. And, he asked. I haven't decided yet. They walked a few paces in silence. Their steps had found a rhythm by now, easier than the corridor 2 nights ago, less deliberate. His hands were clasped behind his back. Hers were in her pockets, which was not strictly proper, and she had stopped caring about strictly proper sometime in the second year at Harcourt. Eleanor, he said. I would like. He stopped. She waited without the old anxiety, just waited. I would like to come to Bath. For the remainder of the season. If you, another stop. James Cavendish visibly locating the correct word and for once not finding it immediately. If that would not be unwelcome. She looked at the river. She thought of the 7 minutes past 11. Of the 10 o'clock this morning. Of the crack in his voice when he'd said I know what I did. She thought of Aldrich Weston in a ballroom, leaning slightly toward her, asking about a crow. She thought of herself in gold, laughing before she knew she was being watched, which was the only kind of laughing that counted. It would not be unwelcome, she said carefully. Not yes. Not please. Not the relieved capitulation of a girl who needed saving. Just not unwelcome. A door left slightly open by a woman who had learned the difference between an open door and an invitation, and intended for once to make someone learn it too. His exhale was quiet. Thank you. She nodded and they walked on, and the river went its own way beside them, unbothered and continuous the way rivers are. That afternoon, a note arrived from the Duke of Weston. No preamble. No social architecture. Just 7 words in a clean, direct hand. The Botanical Gardens. Thursday at 2. W. Eleanor read it once. Read it again. Folded it along its original crease with hands that were very nearly steady. Lady Crosswick appeared in the doorway with the expression of a woman who had absolutely not been listening. Tea, she offered. Please, said Eleanor. She put the note in her pocket and sat down and tried to remember what it felt like to want something for herself. Not for duty, not for survival, not because it was the next correct step in a sequence of correct steps, but simply because she wanted it. It felt, she discovered, quite a lot like standing at the edge of something high. Not falling. Just looking down. Measuring the distance. Deciding. Chapter 5. Thursday came with fog. The thick November kind that didn't burn off by morning, that sat in the streets of Bath like it had decided to stay, softening the edges of buildings, muffling hooves on cobblestone, turning the city into something half-imagined. Eleanor stood at her bedroom window at 8:30 and watched a lamplighter move through it, a small warm blur, and thought about the note in her pocket that she had moved from dress to dress for 3 days like a small stone she couldn't set down. The Botanical Gardens. Thursday at 2. W. She had not replied. She had also not declined, which was its own kind of answer, and she was honest enough with herself to know it. James had come every morning. 10 o'clock reliably, the 7 minutes never returned, which she noticed without comment. He had taken her to a lecture on Flemish painters at the Assembly Rooms on Tuesday, which had clearly required research and effort and a willingness to sit through 40 minutes of a man mispronouncing Flemish names. And she had watched James maintain perfect composure throughout and felt something shift in her chest that she resented slightly for being so easily moved. He was trying. The trying was, she searched for the honest word, painful. Not because it was insufficient, because it was real. Because it was so clearly a man excavating something that had been buried under years of efficient distraction, bringing it up into the light with the particular discomfort of someone who does not enjoy being excavated, doing it anyway. She could see the effort it cost him, and she felt the cost, and she did not know what to do with feeling it. She had spent 3 years not feeling it. The transition was imprecise. The Botanical Gardens at 2 o'clock were quiet and cold and smelled of turned earth and the particular green of things surviving in glass houses nearby. Eleanor arrived at 3 minutes past, not nerves, just not having misplaced one glove in the subsequent search, and found Aldrich Weston on a bench near the bare rose beds, reading something she was too far away to identify. He looked up when he heard her footsteps on the gravel. Closed the book without marking the page, which she noticed. A man who either had an excellent memory or simply didn't care where he'd been, only where he was going. "You came," he said. "I considered not coming," she told him honestly. "I know." He stood. "I considered not sending the note." "Why did you?" He looked at her steadily. "Because not sending it would have been the safer choice, and I've been making safe choices for long enough that I've stopped being able to tell them from honest ones." They walked because standing still in November is eventually untenable, moving along the gravel paths between beds that were stripped back and sleeping, the garden showing its bones the way winter gardens do, everything spare and true, none of the summer abundance that makes it easy to overlook the underlying structure. "Your husband has been calling on you," Aldrich said. Not an accusation, not a question exactly. Just a fact placed between them, offered plainly. "Yes. Every morning." "You've been paying attention," she said. "I generally do when something matters to me." A pause, the gravel quiet under their steps. "That is perhaps the difference between us." She glanced at him. "Between you and Cavendish," he clarified with a directness that was so clean it almost didn't register as pointed. He paid attention to everything except the thing in front of him. "I find I have the opposite difficulty." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The fog had thinned slightly, the weak November sun suggesting itself through cloud without committing. A blackbird moved through the bare branches of a nearby elm, decisive and quick. "What is it you think you see?" she asked. "When you pay attention." "To me." He stopped walking. She stopped too, half a step later. That same slight delay as with James in the corridor, except different in quality. With James it had been the walk of two strangers. With Aldrich it was, she searched for it, the stop of two people who had been moving toward something and arrived at it sooner than expected. "A woman," he said, "who built herself a life in a house that wasn't arranged for her, and built it so thoroughly and so well that she doesn't entirely know what to do with someone who arrives and offers to participate." He paused. "I think you're more accustomed to managing on your own than to being seen. And I think being seen frightens you more than being alone did, because alone you knew the dimensions. You'd measured everything." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. The blackbird called once from the elm and went quiet. "That's," she said and stopped. Started again. "That is fairly accurate." "I know." Not with satisfaction. With something gentler than that. "And you, what do you want, Aldrich?" His name came out unplanned without the formal buffer of his title, and neither of them acknowledged it directly. "Not what you see. What do you want from—" She gestured slightly, a small motion that meant this, us, whatever this is in a winter garden in Bath. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might give her the careful answer, the managed answer, the answer a man gives when he's decided how much truth is appropriate. Instead he said, "I want to be in rooms where you are. I want to argue about poetry with you and hear about the crow and know what questions you're asking when you look at paintings. Pause. And I want none of those things badly enough to take them at someone else's cost." The last sentence landed differently than the rest. Quieter. Heavier. She understood what he was saying. He was not asking her to choose him. He was telling her he would not be the reason she made a choice she wasn't ready to make. He was, in the specific and inconvenient language of a man who had his own long experience of safe choices, giving her room. Something rose in her throat that was gratitude and loss simultaneously. A feeling with no clean name, the kind you only get when someone does something genuinely good and the goodness of it is also the ending of something. "You would have been." She stopped. "Yes," he said quietly. "I think I would have." They stood in the bare winter garden with that between them, the thing that wasn't going to happen, and it was sad in the particular way that good things that don't happen are sad. Not tragic, not ruinous, just wistful. A door looked at and not walked through. A country glimpsed from a train window. Then Eleanor straightened slightly, the adjustment so small only someone paying close attention would catch it. And Aldrich Weston was, as established, someone who paid close attention. "He's trying," she said. Not a defense of James. Not an apology to Aldrich. Just the truth of it, offered plainly because he had offered her the same. I know. Aldrich's voice was even. I watched him at the assembly when he realized. I didn't enjoy watching it, but I understood it. Pause. He saw you. Properly. Perhaps for the first time. He looked at her with the gray eyes that had first found her laughing across a ballroom. The question isn't whether he sees you now. It's whether you want to be seen by him. That's yours. No one else's. She found James at Lady Crosswick's house at 4 o'clock. He was in the front parlor, which suggested Lady Crosswick had let him in and left him there, which suggested Lady Crosswick had opinions about Thursday afternoons that she was expressing architecturally. He stood when Eleanor entered, and something in her face must have communicated something, because his own went very still and very watchful. She sat. He sat. I need to ask you something, she said. And I need you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is unflattering. Yes, he said. Simply. No qualification. If I had appeared at that assembly in the grey dress, she said, the one I wore every Tuesday at Harcourt because there was no one to wear anything else for, would you have crossed the room? The silence was complete. She watched him consider the easy answer, the kind answer, the answer a man gives when he knows what's being asked and wants to give the right response. She watched him set it aside. I don't know, he said. She breathed. I want to say yes, he continued. But I didn't cross rooms for 3 years, Eleanor. I didn't write your name in letters. I didn't come home when there was nothing requiring my immediate presence except a wife who had been placed there and left. His voice was low and without excuse. The voice of a man who has decided that honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, is the only currency worth offering. I cannot claim that seeing you in gold was irrelevant. I cannot pretend I was simply waiting for the right moment. There wasn't a right moment. There were 3 years of ordinary moments I didn't use. She looked at her hands. Then why now, she asked. If it took a gold dress and a ballroom to wake you up, why should I trust that it isn't the spectacle you want? That in 6 months, when I'm back at Harcourt in the grey dress, you don't simply forget again. Because, he said and stopped. She looked up. His face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not broken, James Cavendish would not break in a parlor on a Thursday, but open. Raw at the edges. Because I know now. And knowing changes what I am paying attention to. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. The posture of a man abandoning the architecture of composure in favor of something truer. I cannot undo 3 years. I would if that were a thing available to me. What I can do, what I am asking you to let me do, is begin. Not resume. Begin. As though we are starting from this room, this conversation with whatever you are willing to offer. Eleanor sat with that for a long moment. The parlor clock ticked. Outside, the fog had finally thinned to nothing and the late afternoon light came through the curtains clean and pale. The particular light of a day that had committed to being difficult and was only now, at its end, relenting. She thought of the girl who had stood in a church at 19 with her stepmother's relief like a hand at her back. She thought of 3 years of violets outside a study door. She thought of a woman in gold laughing with her whole self before she knew anyone was watching, and the discovery, strange and significant, that she had become someone worth watching without arranging herself to be. She thought of a man in a winter garden saying that's yours, no one else's. She thought of a man in a parlor saying begin. I am not the girl you married, she said. No. His eyes didn't leave her face. You are considerably more than that. I will not go back to quarterly letters about Gates. No. If you disappear into Parliament and forget the name of your own wife again. I won't. James. His name firm, not soft. I am not asking for promises. I have learned what promises cost in this marriage. I am asking for presents. The ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday kind. Not ballrooms. Not grand gestures. Tuesdays. Something happened to his face then. A shift so complete and so quiet it was almost private to witness. His hand resting on his knee moved slightly toward her, not reaching, just moved. The gesture of a man who has run out of words and knows it and doesn't reach for replacements. Tuesdays, he said. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the small distance between them and placed her hand over his, brief, deliberate, a thing chosen rather than felt toward, and felt him go very still beneath the warmth of it. "Then we begin," she said. They left Bath on a Monday. Lady Crosswick saw them off from the Pulteney Street steps with an expression that could not be called sentiment because she would not have permitted it, but which contained the general shape of satisfaction in the way that winter light contains the general shape of warmth, not the thing itself but evidence of it. The carriage was James's. Eleanor sat across from him, which was how they had ridden to her father's house 3 years ago on the morning of the wedding, strangers in a box. She watched the city give way to countryside, Bath's pale stone dissolving into field and hedgerow and the long slow exhale of England in November, and found the silence different this time. Not empty. Not the silence of two people who have run out of things to say. The silence of two people who have decided to take their time. Somewhere in Surrey, James said, "Tell me about the Flemish painters." Eleanor looked up. He was watching her with the attentiveness of a man making good on a promise without announcing it. "Quiet. Steady. There. It might take a while," she said. "We have 16 miles, he said. So she told him. About the light in Vermeer that looks like it comes from inside things rather than landing on them from outside. About the way faces in those paintings are not beautiful so much as present, there and known and unapologetically themselves. About looking at a painting of an ordinary woman in an ordinary room and feeling, for reasons she could not precisely name, less alone. He listened. All 16 miles he listened. When the carriage turned through the gates of Harcourt Manor, the house rose up pale and familiar against the winter sky. Her house, the one she'd built a life inside without permission or instruction, the one that had become, slowly and without ceremony, hers. The crow was on the garden wall. It looked at them both with magnificent indifference. Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in the specific way she felt it now. A feeling not of rescue, not of resolution, but of arrival. The ordinary kind. The kind that doesn't announce itself. "He's judging you," she told James, nodding at the crow. James looked at it gravely. "Is he often right?" "Distressingly so," she said. And when he handed her down from the carriage and she stood on the gravel of her own front drive in the thinning November light, his hand stayed in hers for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, warm, unhurried, not a gesture for an audience. Just his hand. Just hers. Beginning. And that, dear hearts, is where Eleanor Ashworth's story finds its footing, not at the end, but at the start of something that was always hers to choose. She was never invisible. She was simply waiting for the room to go quiet enough to hear herself. If this story found you tonight, if it settled somewhere it needed to, leave a comment. Tell me where you are in the world. Tell me which moment stayed with you. And if you aren't subscribed to Charlotte's Tidal Whispers yet, this is your sign. There are more stories where this one came from. And I promise, they will all make you feel something. Until next time, dear hearts, take care of yourselves.